I want to just say how delighted I am to welcome you to the 91st annual meeting of the Southern Economic Association. It sure does feel good to be back, doesn't it? I want to take a minute to give a shout out to the SEA Office of Secretary Treasurer and his staff who've been working above and beyond. And I mean, you really have absolutely no idea to ensure that this year's SEA meetings accommodated as many of the members as possibly we could, and in as safe and as comfortable a way as we can. So please join me in showing your appreciation to Ben Powell, to Chuck Long, who you'll see kind of running around, especially, to President-elect Art Goldsmith, who put the whole program together, and the rest of the SEA Board of Trustees. And I also want to acknowledge each of your unique circumstances. None of us knows what our colleagues have gone through during the past 2 years. And I want to thank you for your patience and for your grace in spite of your own personal challenges. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. You can continue dining. I'm Art Goldsmith. I'm the President-elect of the Southern Economics Association and Program Chair for the 91st meeting of the SEA. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our luncheon speaker today, the President of the Southern Economics Association, Julie Hotchkiss. Now, Julie has had a remarkable career, in part because she's had 2 separate but related careers. After completing an undergraduate education with majors in economics and French at Willamette University, Julie earned her PhD in economics at Cornell University with a specialty in labor economics and applied econometrics. She immediately took a tenure-track position in the Department of Economics at the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies at Georgia State University. And from the outset, she was successful in the classroom and as a scholar. Julie's published papers in many areas of economics, including health, education, family economics, and for sure, labor economics. Her papers have covered a wide array of topics, ranging from the impacts of tax reform to the effects of air pollution on children's respiratory health, to the effects of immigration, the determinants of social capital, the sources and levels of gender differences and life course outcomes, what we know about mismatch unemployment, and the link between unemployment and family well-being. In fact, it seems hard to find a question that captured the public's imagination where Julie didn't advance our understanding through her research and presentations. Not surprisingly, she rose through the ranks on schedule, and around the time that she became a full professor, she had become a policy advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. Today, she maintains links to the Andrew Young School, but she is also a research economist and senior policy advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, where she continues to publish articles in strong peer-reviewed journals, and she provides valued advice to the bank and community leaders. I should also note that Julie has provided exemplary leadership to the Southern Economics Association over the past 2 years. Her wisdom, clarity of thought, common sense, and gracious way of working with others have been her hallmark. Please join me in welcoming Julie to the podium. Her talk today is entitled Millennials, Maligned, or Miscreants.
See if I can do this without getting unplugged. Art, thank you so much. That was very generous. I appreciate it. As you'll see on the slide, there'll be opportunities for you to participate in some polling during this presentation. So you want to pick up your phone and either text Julie H226 to the number 22333, or online, go to pollev.com/JulieH226 and you'll be all set up to participate in these 3 polls. You only need to do this once. You'll see the instructions show up again, but you don't need to do them again if you just do them one time. You'll get an automatic reply telling you that you're all set to go, that you've entered the polls. So for the past 20 years or so, I've been listening to contacts at the Atlanta Fed complain about millennials. They've talked about how the behavior of this latest cohort to enter the labor market has not really conformed to their ideals, and probably especially how the behavior of these millennials has differed from what they would have done when they were their age. And so I listened to these stories and these complaints from competing emotions of guilt and defensiveness, having brought 2 millennials into this world. And so I thought it was about time to see whether there was any empirical evidence behind this claim that millennials' behavior is somehow different than those of baby boomers, which was the cohort of the ones doing the complaining primarily. Before I continue, I want to emphasize that the views I express here are mine alone and do not necessarily reflect those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta or the Federal Reserve System, or my children for that matter. All right, millennials, known by many names: the echo boom, the baby boomlet, Gen Y, the internet generation. Folks in the millennial generation are generally agreed to have been born between the years of 1981 and 1996. And as of 2019, they are the largest share of the population, which is actually something I didn't know before starting this project. They're also the generation that we love to judge. So here's your first opportunity. You can text a word to end this, to complete the sentence. Millennials are, just text one word. You can participate multiple times. And remember, this is a family-friendly presentation. Chris Bollinger. So you choose your words accordingly while we listen to this familiar tune. Okay, so I wish I could see it on my screen here, but I think I can get a few. I see entitled. That's certainly a popular one. Awesome. There you go. I like that. Okay, spoiled, unattached. Lots of words that are consistent with what I've been hearing over the last 20 years. Now, to be fair, sort of throwing shade on the next generation is a popular pastime with a long history, going back probably to the beginning of time. But there are important economic reasons why we might be interested in how the millennial behaviors might be different than behaviors of the generations that come before. I've heard criticisms that millennials, or concerns, if you will, that millennials would provide enough labor or consume enough or invest enough in order to fuel this economic growth that we've come to know and love. We also might be concerned that this behavior of this new generation is not the same as the behavior upon which we've built our economic models for making predictions for policy. And of course, we are concerned that they're going to work enough to pay for our retirement. I want to define the rest of the generations that I'll be mentioning and comparing the millennials to. The silent generation, typically agreed to be born between the years 1928 and 1945. the baby boom generation, 1964 or 1946 to 1964, Gen X, 1965 to 1980, and then the millennial generation, of course. And then we have Generation Z. Now I've heard about Generation Alpha, going back to the beginning of the alphabet, born after 2016. Now, in order to look at the characteristics of the millennial generation, I've created a sample from the current population survey from the year 2019, which roughly covers millennials who are between the ages of 20 to 40. So that's about the age range I'm going to be looking at here. So in order to compare them to previous generations, I've created samples from the years in which those generations also fell between about 20 and 40. So that was 1967 for the silent generation, 1985 for the baby boom, 2003 for Gen X. And I'm sorry if there's anyone in here from Gen Z, but I'm not going to talk about you at all today. All right, so here's your next chance. All right, we've got this, you only get one chance to answer here. So enter A, B, C, D, or E, depending on which generation you belong to. And we'll see what our distribution looks like. Oh, for goodness sakes, that's surprising. I can't see it here. So X is A, B, C. Wow. Oh, whoops. Sorry. I forgot to play the sound. So you get a little extra time here. I forgot to start the clock ticking. All right, the polls are closed. All right, so this was a little surprising to me, although the millennials are the the largest share of the population. I was expecting a little bit more older people here, but looking out in the crowd, I can see it is a young crowd. So that's who we're talking to. But besides just the years of birth defining a generation, generations are also defined by common events that took place during their lifetime, and particularly during the years in which they were sort of coming of age. And it would be naive to think that these common experiences didn't have some impact on how we observe the generations or members of this generation behaving or the choices that they make. For example, the Great Recession likely has had great influence on the sense of financial security that the millennials feel. Hurricanes Katrina and Sandy, in addition to other environmental events, likely have affected the sense of environmental security among millennials. And then, of course, the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the increase in the number of mass shootings per year likely have affected overall sense of safety among this generation as well. And so I want to share some characteristics and some comparisons of the millennials with previous generations. These are characteristics and comparisons that you're probably fairly familiar with, but are likely have been influenced by those events that the millennials have experienced, as seen on the previous slide. So as you can see, of course, the millennials are increasing this trend of greater education. Millennials between the ages of 20 and 40 are much less likely than the previous generations to be married, and they're less likely than the previous generation to have any children between these ages. And of course, their choices to live in the city is a continuation of ongoing trends as well. Now, I mentioned several concerns early on, and one of them was a concern about whether or not millennials are consuming enough. Well, a major source for that concern is the fact that real median hourly pay has been declining across the generations. And only for the college educated have we seen an increase in the real median hourly pay over time. And there's also was expressed a concern about millennials' net worth, accumulation of net worth. And so also comparing between the ages of 20 and 40, you can see that millennials were less likely to own a home than the previous two generations, less likely to own stock than the Gen X, are about on par with baby boom generation at this age, at the same age. And then, of course, millennials are facing more debt than the previous two generations, like most commonly attributed to an increase in student debt. And then the net result is a significant lower net wealth between the ages of 20 and 40 than experienced by both baby boomers and Gen X during the same age range. And then, of course, the behavior that I'm going to talk about the most here is labor supply. I ran across this meme early on, and it says this new generation does not like working. You could give these whippersnappers, and remember, family friendly, you could give these whippersnappers a job sleeping and they'd wake up just to quit. All right, so is there any empirical evidence to support this characterization of the millennials? Well, here's a distribution of hours of work, usual hours worked per week, comparing baby boomers and millennials. And so millennials are the light blue bar, and the baby boomers are the dark red bar histogram. And so you can see that the red bars are mostly to the right of the light blue bars. And so there is some evidence that millennials work fewer hours per week than baby boomers. Now, on the extensive margin, we also see that the probability or the share of each of the generations actually being in the labor force at any given time is lower than for the other two generations as well, between the same ages. And so there is some empirical evidence that to support this criticism that millennials are essentially working less than the previous generations. All right, so what I was interested in knowing is how this observation of working less, or how characteristics, differences in characteristics and differences in behavior between millennials and baby boomers were contributing to the differences in hours of work and decision to work at all between the two generations. And so I undertake estimation of labor supply equations. I estimate this separately by cohort, which is essential. I look both at the intensive margin and the extensive margin. The intensive margin is simply ordinary least squares analysis of how usual hours per week varies across workers. And the extensive margin is an ordered logit analysis of the decision to not work, to work part-time, and to work full-time. I do all sorts of stuff, like instrumenting out the wages because they're endogenous, imputing wages for non-workers, all that, boring stuff I won't talk about. And then I apply the differences that I find in these estimates to real life policy considerations to see whether they really matter. And then decide whether, what this analysis has to say about whether or not millennials could be considered miscreants or simply maligned. All right, so the first set of analysis, the first sort of simulation I want to perform from having undertaken this analysis is to ask the question, what would the labor supply of millennials look like if millennials acted like baby boomers? So here we have a solid red line, which reflects the hours distribution, the predicted hours distribution for millennials that come from taking the characteristics of millennials and the parameter coefficients for millennials from estimating the labor supply equation. And this is just basically the predicted hours distribution for millennials. The dashed red line reflects combining the characteristic of millennials. So I take my millennial sample and I apply the baby boomer characteristics to that sample, the parameter estimates, to get a prediction of what the hours distribution would look like for millennials if they acted like baby boomers. And as you can see, the distribution moves to the right. And if millennials acted like boomers, they would work more. If millennials acted like boomers, they would be more responsive to wage changes. They would be more responsive to changes in non-labor income. Their labor supply would be more affected by marriage and children. And then, of course, there's that pesky unobserved factor that basically just says boomers work more than millennials. And we can turn this question on its head and ask the question, what if millennials looked like boomers? We have the same distribution, the solid red line of the millennial hours distribution. And the dashed red line now is taking the millennial behavior, the parameter estimates from the millennial estimation, and applying the characteristics of the baby boomers. And what the conclusion here is that if millennials looked like boomers, they would work less. If millennials looked like boomers, they would have less education. They would have lower wages among the college educated. They would have more children, and they would be facing worse economic conditions as the economic environment in 1985 was worse than it was in 2019. Now we get the same results on the extensive margin. Here, the red lines are the probabilities of not working, working part-time, and working full-time. And the red bars reflect the prediction for the millennial sample using the millennial parameter estimates. If millennials acted like boomers, they would be less likely to be not working and more likely to be full-time employed. If millennials had boomer characteristics, then they would be more likely to not work and less likely to be working full-time. So the fact is that millennials are working less, but it's more complicated than that. Their behavior is working in such a way to pull them out of the labor market, but their characteristics are such that it's propping it up. The net result is that they're working less, but it's more nuanced than simply that. So with these labor supply equation estimations, I also can calculate labor supply elasticities to determine how responsive millennials are to changes in wages and non-labor income relative to how responsive boomers are to changes in wages and non-labor income. So we can see that baby boomers have a higher wage elasticity than millennials, meaning that they adjust their labor supply more dramatically when they face a wage change or a tax change or for whatever reason than millennials would. And the same for non-labor income. Baby boomers are more responsive to changes that they might face in their non-labor income than millennials. And then economic elasticities is basically the response that these two cohorts might have to changes in the economic condition, unemployment rates and things like that. And so the bottom line is that millennial wage elasticity is 15% lower than boomers. Millennials are 15% lower, if you will, responsive to changes in wages. Millennials are roughly, again, this is using language loosely, 32% lower than boomers in response to changes in income elasticity. And the natural question is whether or not those numbers are very big or what the implication might be if considering specific policies. So I'm going to look at a couple of different policies. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act essentially gave everybody a 4% pay increase. All right, the marginal tax rates were lowered on average by about 4 percentage points. And then we had a more recent policy of the stimulus checks of 2020 CARES Act, which basically just gave money to adults and children subject to certain income limits. And so the simulated response, just applying these estimated elasticities, would be that for the millennials as a group, we would predict to see an increase of about 350,000 hours per week worked in response to this tax cut. And in response to the COVID stimulus checks, a decline in hours of about 2.1 million hours per week for the whole millennials as a group, 55 million of them or something. All right, so if millennials acted like boomers, the prediction would be a smaller decline, a smaller increase in hours of work as a result of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and a much larger increase in or decrease in numbers of hours worked in response to the COVID stimulus check. Now, of course, the boomers are more responsive. So why do we see a smaller response to the TCJA if millennials acted like boomers? And it's because, of course, there's both a substitution and an income effect, with an increase in the wage that people are getting paid or taking home. We have a substitution effect, a larger substitution effect if they acted like boomers, pulling them into the labor market, but also a dominating larger income effect pulling them out. So that's why we see a smaller response there. All right, so far, so that's it. So that's what I've learned sort of empirically, and it leads to the natural question of why is millennials' labor supply less responsive to changes in wages and non-labor income than baby boomers' labor supply. And the rest of the talk is like pure speculation, okay? Sort of throwing out some ideas for somebody else to pick up and prove or not. All right, so the first thing that's real obvious is that the millennials were the first generation to grow up in two-earner households. You see the rise in the share of households with children under 18 with two-earner parents, especially from 1960 to 1990. Of course, at the same time, there's an analogous decline in the share of households with a single earner. And lo and behold, the dual income families cross or become the dominant family structure right about the time when millennials entered the world, okay? Now, what are the implications of this? Well, first of all, millennials have observed their parents juggling work and family and the struggles that go along with that. Many surveys report that families report that that balancing work and family are very, very difficult. Of course, more women report that than men do, but it's felt both ways. And also another survey reported that children interpreted the interruption of their mother's career as a positive attribute in the family. So presumably an interruption in that career meant she was spending more time with the family, and that was seen as a positive thing by the children. The implication likely is that millennials have observed and lived with these struggles and have decided that they want to do things differently, that they are going to choose a different balancing act of work and family than their parents did. In addition to that, growing up in two-earner households means that these millennials have grown up in families that are more affluent, of course, all else equal, leading to the obvious income effect, pulling millennials away from the labor market. Some evidence of this is that by 2014, living with parents had become the dominant living arrangement for 18 to 34-year-olds for the first time. Additionally, many people have documented a decline in teen labor supply, which is consistent with an income effect, pulling teens out of the labor force. You don't need to get a weekend job to provide spending money that's already there. And this is exacerbated by various policies like graduated teen driver's licenses. In addition to growing up in two-earner families, we've also seen over this time period, as millennials were growing up, sort of an explosion in inexpensive digital entertainment. Internet gaming and movies and just simply socializing has become more prevalent, and it also has the price of leisure generally through these outlets has gone down. So both of those things, the increase in the value of leisure and the decrease in its price, is going to lead to a substitution effect and a pull and a consumption demand for more of this leisure. All right, additionally, a paper out this year by Darren Asimoglu found that millennials identified millennials as having more independent characters. I know about this as parent of two of them. They have more independent characters And he linked this with less responsiveness to labor market incentives. So this is the change in behavior, I believe, that we've been hearing about from our contacts at the Atlanta Fed. And because this independence is, I guess, bad news for employers. Workers are less compliant, they're less obedient, they're not going to, act the way that you expect them to. But on the other hand, it's also been linked, independent character has also been linked to greater entrepreneurial tendencies and greater competencies, which could be good news for overall productivity. And if we're concerned about prediction accuracy of policy, then having less volatile behavior might also be good news. And then from a social perspective, more independence is also linked with greater political activity. So that could be a good thing. So yes, millennials are different from boomers. They differ in characteristics, they differ in behavior. We see that millennials' labor supply is less responsive to changes in wages and non-labor income. And so if we want to actually affect the labor supply of millennials, this begs the question of how do we go about doing that? If two of our tools has been taken out of the toolbox. Well, perhaps we need to focus on policies that emphasize something other than wages. Quality of life policies, child leave policies, health insurance, relief from student debt, providing meaningful jobs. There's surveys that have found that millennials would be willing to take a pay cut if they were able to work with a firm that was dedicated to corporate social responsibility values. They also, 80% of them have said in another survey that they would like to work with a firm with a conscience. So even if the jobs aren't meaningful, perhaps there are other things employers could do to keep their millennials engaged and working hard. Also, we could provide assistance caring for aging parents. All right, so I want to make it clear that I understand that the results here do not apply to every single millennial. All right, everyone's different, and we can't generalize to that extent. And also that the behavior differences identified between the ages of 20 and 40 between millennials and baby boomers may not apply to the ages of 50 to 70. And so very well may not apply over time. And then, of course, this collective reconsideration of COVID-19 might mean that all of my labor supply elasticities prior to 2020 just need to be thrown out the window and start over. All right, so here's the last poll. You get to choose now, based on either what you've seen or your previous bias of one way or the other. Choose A or B about whether or not millennials are maligned or miscreants. Of course, remember the distribution we had earlier. I think the verdict is in. Very good. Well done. I think those of you who voted for miscreants are probably being moved by the fact that there is evidence that millennials are working less overall. But those of you who voted for maligned clearly see that perhaps millennials are just making a different calculation of trade-offs between leisure and income. In other words, millennials work to live rather than live to work. I'd like to suggest that rather than worrying about why millennials aren't making the same decisions as their parents, that we focus more on how financial and environmental concerns are bearing on those decisions. Certainly, student debt is playing an important role in millennials' ability to accumulate wealth, and concerns about the environment are likely affecting and constraining life decisions. And I think that this has important implications for things like how we think about full employment. So full employment is something, of course, we're particularly interested in at the Atlanta Fed. And perhaps it's the notion goes beyond just a lower unemployment rate. You know, our goal can be something different than just a low unemployment rate to consider that we've achieved full employment. Perhaps full employment means more about the environment in which workers are making decisions about their labor supply, sort of whether to work, how much to work, what job to take. If these decisions are being made in an environment with constraints and concerns, then workers necessarily are going to be less productive. All right, I want to end with this picture, which I just love, and this placard, which reads, "Lead, follow, or get out of our way." This placard sort of gives me sort of comfort, I guess, if you will, and tells me that if we don't change the environment for the millennials or even the generations coming along afterward in order to release them from these constraints that aren't necessary, that they'll figure it out and they'll take care of it themselves. So thanks very much.